Hello, and thanks for joining us on Encore. Coming up on today's show, art is theft, so said Picasso, but what about if you quote your sources? That's one of the questions thrown up by author Jeremy Gavron in his latest book, Felix Culpa, not to mention the mystery surrounding the protagonist himself. Jeremy joins us in the studio to talk literary borrowings and more. Jeremy, thanks for joining us today. Your new novel, Felix Culpa, certainly features a central character called Felix, but what's more striking about it is the form. In fact, it's a sort of literary collage made up from lines sourced from other books. Why this approach?
Well, that's a very good question. There isn't a simple or single answer I can give you, but certainly I've always thought that stories, all stories, as all art, are made up of earlier stories and part of earlier stories, as art is made up partly of earlier art. And so this was a chance for me to do maybe what many novelists do surreptitiously, to do it more openly, and in fact, like, as you quoted Picasso, to celebrate my own influences, the influences in this book.
OK, so how did you go about doing it practically? Because there are more than 100 books cited, about 100 books cited in the index. Did you reread all of those books? Well,
I did eventually. I mean, it was a process, a slow, organic process. I didn't set out in a kind of Oulipo-like way with a plan to do this. It was something that grew over a period of years in the writing of the book. But eventually, yes, I went through lots of old books, old favourite books with a red pen.
Wow, very methodical. So to get a better idea of the novel, could you perhaps read us an extract of it?
Yes. So I'm just going to read you the first half of a chapter. These are very short chapters. And this is a point at which a writer is investigating the story of a young man who's been found dead in mysterious circumstances. And he's wandering around a city on the trail of this young man. I'm just going to put my glasses on. Own journeying began to take upon itself the shape of a tale, like a vagabond from place to place, south, then east, then north, through the vastness, the streets according to the pull and the feeling, labyrinth of dark, narrow courts, little step-down taverns panelled with rum-soaked timbers. Can I help you? Just waiting for someone, I said to the bartender, ferreting around in every weird underworld he could find, winding alleys, dead ends, residents of none but low ruffians. What you doing sneaking at the door? Who are you looking for? Guy who's spent 5 years in jail. Diminutive in stature, unsociable and solitary like the true leopard. In the evening when I was at home, I wrote it all down in a notebook, till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Piled desk, head outlined by a halo of light, climbing the gully between the mountains of books.
Now, we get a good idea that the rhythm of the writing there is very important. It's almost poetry more than prose. And I know that as well as being an author, you also teach creative writing and at the Warren Wilson College in North Carolina. So we spoke to one of your colleagues there, poet and teacher Morris Manning, who told us a bit more about borrowed lines.
T.S. Eliot stole from many writers for The Wasteland. And we still regard The Wasteland as Eliot's original work. In a way, once a writer reaches a certain age or has 30 years into the work of writing, eventually it seems that everything a writer has to say in writing is a reflection of everything she or he has read. And it's a gift back.
So Morris is obviously on board with borrowing, and you recently wrote in praise of plagiarism, an article which quoted some pertinent examples in pop culture. But some people do get up in arms about this idea of literary or artistic theft, the idea of intellectual property. Do you think they have a point?
Well, I should point out that was the title of the article I wrote. I didn't write that title. The article certainly wasn't in praise of plagiarism. It was about celebrating influence. I don't think plagiarism is a good idea, and I don't think to break copyright is a good idea. But I think to acknowledge and reference your influences as a writer, I do think is a good thing. And Maurice was actually one of the sources. He wrote one of the books that's the sources for this book, a book of poetry. And Maurice, where I teach with him, he gave a lecture just this past January in which he talked about how nature is constantly recycling and how we as artists, in a way, mimic nature in that way.
So it's a natural thing to do.
Yeah.
Given that the list of books that you quote from in Felix Culpa are quite well known, some of them are literary classics, some of the lines feel very familiar, but you're not sure as a reader if you know them or not. What do you think familiarity does? What effect does it have on us?
Well, one of the reasons of writing the book in this way is to try and create a resonance with these lines, so that even if you don't know where they're from, and there are something like 1,800 lines from other books, so most readers would only know a few of them, and I also tried not to take well-known lines, but to create a sense of resonance, of echo, when you read the book.
Now, there's a quote that I was very struck by in Felix Culpa on page 49, which says, "Nobody," my mother said, "knows anything about anyone else, not even about a close neighbour, not even about the person you're married to, or about your parent or your child." Was that a borrowed line, or was that your own?
That was a borrowed line from Amos Oz, the Israeli writer. But it was something that was very pertinent to me because my own mother died of suicide when I was 4. And my previous book to this was an investigation into her life and death, so an attempt to find out about her. And it was from that, it was a sort of process of discovery of how much we can ever know about another person, which is also what this book is about.
I wanted to ask about that book, A Woman on the Edge of Time. It's a very moving and emotional account of something very personal, a search for understanding. Was the decision to explore that a difficult one?
Yes, it was very difficult. I grew up in a house in which we never spoke about my mother, so it was a taboo subject. And it took me until I was in my 40s, 20 years after I'd become a journalist, after I'd written several books, before I could really had the confidence to write my own story, write the story of my own family.
And indeed, you mentioned journalism. This is a personal account of trying to understand your mother, but the way you approached it's very methodical, very journalistic in a way. What did you bring from journalism into your fictional writing?
Well, that's a good question. I think certainly brevity, clarity, but I also had to unlearn things, moving from being a journalist to a writer of fiction. I had to sort of embrace mystery and enigma, uncertainty in a way that journalism doesn't normally engage with.
Is there anything you miss from journalism?
Yes, I missed the excitement. I worked on a daily newspaper, so I missed the sort of the rhythm of a daily newspaper, going places. You know, all I ever go to now is my little office under the eaves in my house.
Now, Felix Culpa has some literary advice in it as well. In the first chapter, it says, "If it sounds like writing, start again." That's very good advice. What's the best literary advice you've ever received?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think follow your own heart. Follow your, only write what only you can write.
Only personal stories then. Now, finally, one writer who's found herself in the news for her prescience when it comes to US politics is Margaret Atwood. Some people say that her dystopian visions are coming true when it comes to women's rights. You're a fan of hers, I believe.
Yes, absolutely.
And you've advised us to check out the series based on her 1996 novel Alias Grace. Why is that?
Well, I haven't actually seen this series yet, but I'm very much looking forward to doing so. Obviously, I saw The Handmaid's Tale, which I thought, even in a golden age of television, is one of the most remarkable pieces of television. And as you were saying, she's such a prescient writer. She seems to be able to write about the future or the past and still be writing not only about our own time, but predicting what's going to happen. So I'm really interested to see myself whether Alias Grace will engage with our political situation in the way that The Handmaid's Tale. And I think also Sarah Polley, who has directed it, is a fantastic director.
I'm sure it will be political. Jeremy, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll leave you with a clip of Alias Grace, which is available to watch on Netflix. Do remember to check out our website, and you can keep up with Encore on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.
I think of all the things that have been written about me. That I am an inhuman female demon. That I am an innocent victim of a blackguard forced against my will and in danger of my own life.
Very deep within her, the knowledge is there.
Knowledge of guilt or of innocence.
I'm cunning and devious. How can I be all these different things at once?
You're very curious for such a young person.
Murderous is a strong word to have attached to you. Murderer is merely brutal. I'd rather be a murderess than a murderer, if those were the only choices.